On November 8, 2022, Village of Skokie voters approved 3 binding referendum questions to modify the village's electoral process. One of these 3 referendums was to adopt a system of hybrid elections for village trustees, in which 2 of the 6 village trustees would continue to be elected at large, while the other 4 village trustees would be elected from districts. Now, creating these districts is not as simple as drawing a few lines across a map of the village. To assist with the complicated task of creating this map in alignment with national and state law and mapping best practices, Village Manager John Lockerbie enlisted the assistance of mapping consultant Peter Creticos. Let's listen as he shares a little bit about his process and the results.
The process is straightforward. The first step is, frankly, to get familiar with the community. Did a couple drive-throughs. Met with staff at the village. Obviously, we had the public meeting at the end of August where we took some input from the public in terms of their thoughts and ideas about how Skokie should be divided into 4 districts. And then from that, and then based on my own experience in terms of how to approach the process of conceptualizing a map, developed some principles that I thought would be useful in terms of guiding the process and guiding my own thinking. First and foremost, obviously, is the one person, one vote concept, which is essentially that the district should be as equal in population as practical. There is some allowance for variation, and we keep that within the plus or minus 5%. The second is contiguous and compact. Contiguous is fairly simple, and that is that you can't have gaps, that the district is confined by a continuous line, and then there are no donuts within that. And then compact is more of in the eye of the beholder. You want to be able to have it so that the districts are reasonably shaped, and then don't create odd extensions beyond a sort of a simple model. And then in thinking through the village of Skokie, and one thing that strikes me about Skokie is that there is sort of a center point to Skokie that is in the general vicinity of Village Hall, the golf course. That's where you have a lot of municipal services concentrated, like the village and the library. And as it turns out, it's also the way other government services are distributed, which are largely on a quadrant basis. And so you think of these, 4 sort of, potentially 4 rectangles that connect to each other somewhere in the middle of Skokie. It's also important that voters intuitively understand where these district boundaries are. So it's important, where practical, to follow either major thoroughfares, existing boundaries, in terms of boundaries of other jurisdictions that cross into Skokie. And then again, other physical features. Another is communities of interest, and again, they're not well defined. It's sort of like you know it when you see it. And there we were looking for some proxies because it's not entirely clear that Skokie has distinct neighborhoods around which people organize their lives. But one thing that Skokie does have is several school districts that are either wholly or largely contained within the village. And school districts make for good proxies in terms of how communities of people come together. And it's not just kids, families with school-age kids. It's also for instance, people displaying signs and say, I'm the proud parent of a kid that goes to X school. And you see those signs there, and it's a way in which people sort of declare their relationship to an institution, and one that sort of bleeds into the way a community might think about itself. Another consideration is sort of how do the 2 edges of the district relate to each other. So if you think of a long, narrow district that may stretch from McCormick on the east to across Eden's Expressway on the west, and you drew a district that had those two pieces in it, those two ends to it, do the people in McCormick have any sort of relationship or identity with the people who live west of the expressway? My thinking is, my understanding of the way the village functions is that that doesn't connect. And the same would be if you have somebody that lives north of Memorial Cemetery and then somebody who lives along the edge of Lincolnwood. Those two ends don't really relate to each other. Another consideration is sort of making sure that to the best as possible, you're not cutting neighborhoods off from each other. So an example would be that the residential area that's north of Old Orchard Road and east of Skokie Boulevard, that's a neighborhood that could be isolated because of Memorial Park and the hospital and so forth. So to me, it's important to create a way in which that particular, as an example, that neighborhood be connected to other residential areas. Several people in the prior meeting in August brought out the idea, and we've seen this in public comment, on providing some options for general consideration by the public. And so what we've done is we've took these principles and around it established a framework that was essentially a quadrant-based approach to Skokie, and then develop three ideas around that quadrant approach. And we labeled them Orchard, Prairie, and Marsh, just so that we can distinguish between the three of them. So the Orchard proposal is the one that comes closest to being a preferred map along basically two avenues of thinking. If you look at population alone, this is the closest to perfect than the other when compared to the other two maps. And so from a population standpoint, it closely divides Skokie into equal parts. The second is that this particular map leaves intact apartment complexes, the apartment buildings that exist north of Main and west of Skokie Boulevard. That is an area of older apartment buildings. It happens to be an area I lived in decades ago, and one where I think if anybody driving through it or anybody who sort of lives in that area appreciates that there's some commonality there, and so there is sort of an identity to that neighborhood, which I thought made some sense to try to keep intact. The second option, which is Prairie, makes the point of there being a center point. So of the three choices, this is the only map that actually has all four districts coming together at the same point. It has a triangle to it. It does divide that neighborhood that I was just describing a bit. It still maintains for those two pieces to be able to express a voice. The third map, which we call Marsh, to my eye is the one that has discrete blocks to it. Although all three maps in terms of compactness come out about the same, this one appears to be more compact. The one thing that distinguishes this particular approach to the other two is that we follow the larger thoroughfares more closely in the division between districts 3 and 4, where we follow Costner as a major boundary, whereas in the other two, they drift over to Kenton. So in terms of the sort of the ability to be able to say, Costner is the boundary, and that seems to be a more natural division for some people. That map uses Costner as that boundary. All three maps, I think they're intuitively understandable and maps that are consistent with the way people would regard communities within Skokie itself.